Hello and welcome to the Justice and Coffee podcast, the podcast where we discuss a variety of justice-related issues affecting the world over a cup of coffee. On this episode, we are returning to our look at the UK criminal justice system, with a particular focus on the prisons in this country. Today's podcast is the second half of a two-parter, so if you haven't heard the previous one, please do listen back and hear our conversation with Bex. Bex is someone who grew up in and out of prison, more in than out during her younger years, and she gave a remarkably articulate description of her experience going through the criminal justice system, committing offences, serving sentences, some short, some long, and the impact of drugs and homelessness, and ultimately what caused her to change. I spoke to Bex just before Christmas alongside Dr Sarah Senker. Sarah is a chartered psychologist and a research consultant with a specific interest in the issues of prison reform and supporting offender rehabilitation. And we had our conversation about an hour after we spoke to Bex, and I got to ask her why she chooses to spend so much of her career studying this element of society, and why we should care about what happens inside our prisons, or for the rights of our prisoners. And the rest, well, I'll just let you listen along yourselves. Sarah, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm good, thank you so much for having me.
Isn't this exciting? We're not in our usual space. We're in a Jury's Inn hotel on Brighton seafront. We've come down to do a bit of a special recording, and I want you to introduce yourself. So just tell me a little bit about how you became a doctor and where your specialism is.
Okay, so I am Dr Sarah Senker.
Do you insist on everyone calling you doctor?
Absolutely.
Fair enough, I would.
Yeah, electricity companies, any drop-down box, I'm ticking doctor. I worked hard for that, for sure.
Yeah.
So the reason I'm a doctor is because I have a PhD, and my PhD was in health and human sciences, which doesn't really explain what I do, because my background is psychology and criminal justice, health and substance misuse, that kind of thing.
Fascinating. And you've been doing this since university?
Yeah, pretty much, yes. Not stopped since uni. Undergrad, masters, PhD, started my own research company, just kept going.
Amazing. Like normally we start, I try and do a bit of fluff at the start about coffee, but we've just dived straight in there today. I mean, you can tell me, I'm always interested in how people take their coffee.
I'm obsessed with coffee.
Good girl.
I tend to think about it from the minute I wake up, like when am I going to have my coffee? Where am I going to have my coffee? But I do have it offensively milky. I love a latte. I used to have it all syrupy, but no, just now straight up. Coffee and milk, and normally with an oat milk, that would be my preference.
Is that any reason you're like lactose intolerant or?
I'm lactose intolerant.
Yeah, it's one of those, isn't it? I'm beginning to think that
It's not...
I might have something like that. I think it's lactose, but every time I love pizza, but every time I have pizza, like afterwards, I just feel it's just indigestion. It's just indigestion.
I'm glad you've gone with the indigestion.
No, it is. I promise. It's just I end up having to just take a couple of like those indigestion tablets. But I just love pizza so much. It's weird, isn't it? You get slightly older, your body starts responding differently to things.
So I'm actually grateful that it's become trendy to have dairy alternatives.
So trendy.
Because when I was first told I was lactose intolerant, you just couldn't go into a coffee shop and get soya or oat or almond or cashew or all these different things. But now, well, we're in Brighton, it's like you can have any milk that you want, probably.
Yeah.
From a stone or, anything.
It's pretty difficult.
Yeah.
Back on to finding out about Dr. Sarah Senker. I want to know, obviously one of the reasons I invited you on the podcast is not just because of your research and your area of specialism, but you've clearly got a passion to find out as much as you can and to provide advice and some sort of level of consultation on the criminal justice system in this country. And I just kind of want to know, where did that journey begin for you?
So that's a question I've been asked quite a lot, and I don't really think there's like a clear answer, but what I do know is that when I was growing up, I was in a sort of a paradox of a household where my mum was super straight-laced. Like if a we were in a petrol station once, and some polos accidentally fell in her bag, and she went back the next day to take them back. Like she's like super straight laced. And then my dad, who grew up in the East End, my granddad was in prison. My dad always had sort of like friends and associates round, and they looked like they were from some sort of film, and it wasn't like Bambi or anything, and all these wonderful stories that they'd sit around and tell. And I just was so intrigued by what could make two people who'd come together but be so different. Like why was it that, well, just some people in general think it's okay to commit crime, or they choose to commit crime, whereas I'm like my mum, and I would never break the law like knowingly. So I was just intrigued, like what is it that causes somebody to behave in that way? And then kind of pursued that that question in a more formal kind of academic setting. I wanted to understand the drivers and the causes, and then importantly how we can make people stop or help people stop committing crime.
Amazing. Do you feel like you reached certain conclusions in your research up to this point
about the drivers of crime? What causes someone to commit crime, you mean?
Yeah, in respect to what causes people to commit crime, and in terms of a better approaches to dealing with the criminal fraternity, or people that get drawn into crime.
Yeah, so I think that it's easy for us to think that in like really binary terms, like either you're a criminal or you're not, or you're an offender or you're not, when actually it's really not that clear, and there's this real sliding scale. And, as I'm sure you're aware, everybody has a backstory, and everyone has a really interesting, rich story, which I love about my job, that I get to hear people's stories. And inevitably it will be, I'm sort of in the nurture camp rather than nature. And I think that most people's life experiences will have led them to make sort of certain decisions, which sometimes it's a means of survival. When we were talking to Bex earlier, and she's talking about coming out from prison with £46 and nowhere to live. Sometimes people are forced to commit crime because they simply have no choice. I haven't met anybody, I rarely meet people in the criminal justice system who have come from a really loving, happy, well-adjusted background. And that's not to say that people who don't come from those backgrounds will always go on to commit crime, but there is a correlation. And I think that can't be ignored. And so in terms of what we can do to support people out of crime, fostering an environment that maybe they haven't had in their upbringing, that's healthy, that's positive, that's instills aspiration into them, that nurtures them, I think that's really only a positive thing. And yet that feels incongruent when you're looking at somebody who's maybe done something that's really harmful or hurt another person. That can feel like an uncomfortable thing to say publicly, but actually I do really think that that's the way forward.
I think sometimes maybe it's more difficult for charities and organisations that work with ex-offenders to, I might be completely wrong, but to rally support for that cause above other causes, because there's a certain sense of, why am I spending my money to help this person that's committed a crime when I could use the same money in so many other causes? But that's a challenge, because of course we want to stop reoffending. We want to look at, why is that happening in the first place? And if we ignore it and we just lock people away and think, well, we've dealt with it, right? They've committed a crime, we've stuck them in a building with bars, and that will sort them out. Of course it doesn't.
Exactly.
Well, at least my experience of it, in most cases, in some cases it's pretty ineffective, just locking someone away without maybe putting something into their time there. Do you feel like, so we dive straight in here, but time spent in prison, it could be a positive thing, or is it always just a negative thing?
Well, that's actually something that we touched upon. Well, Bex mentioned something earlier as well, which is that prison can be a real opportunity for somebody if it's used in a constructive way, and if that person is given opportunities whilst they're in prison. And exactly as you said, we don't live in a country where people are given a sentence, like in America, where they're given sort of 300 life sentences. There's a very small number of people in our prison system who are never going to be released, but the majority will be. So that's why we absolutely have a duty to enable the justice system to be an opportunity for change. And like we've just touched on, that can feel like an unpopular discourse. I often get asked, why do you want to help these people? Like, why are you using your skills or your resources to help these people? And it's like, well, when you say these people, do you speed? Have you never lost your temper in a moment of rage? And also the people that are in our prison system are so often also a victim. But again, we put them in a box. You're either a victim or a perpetrator, when actually you can be both. And I'm kind of glad that you raised this, actually, because in coming on the podcast and in having listened to previous episodes, which obviously talks about human trafficking and modern slavery, which are catastrophic offences, I was thinking, gosh, how can I come on here and advocate for rehabilitation or any kind of kindness towards perpetrators when to date we've kind of been quite victim-led, quite rightly, but it's about thinking about realistically these people are going to come back into society, and for everyone's sake it's beneficial to kind of offer them support and opportunity to change.
I think from my perspective, time spent in the police really, in some regard, there but by the grace of God go I, found people in situations that have behaved actually quite normally and sometimes quite reasonably, but things have gone very, very badly for them as a consequence of their environment or whatever. And before they know it, they're stepped before a court and sent down for a prison term. And obviously the consequences of being an ex-offender, having that on their record when you're then going for jobs. Now, I know there's legislation to protect that, to give them a fair chance at a new job. But, reality is that life becomes a lot more difficult once you've got a stained record. Where were you between these dates? Why is there no job there? Actually, because I was inside for an assault or whatever. It's tough, and life isn't, you said, it's not binary, it's not black and white. Sarah, I wonder if, you mentioned living in a household with two different characters in your parents, but this interest in finding justice, finding something that is right in a system that's broken, that's ailing, where does that go back to university, or does it come back to an earlier stage in your life of seeing what's right and wrong?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it was almost inherent in me. My mum will tell stories of me coming out of school, sort of holding a hand of someone who's, to all intents and purposes, a bit of a muddle. And I had a girl come round once when I was probably about 5, and she came home, took her shoes off, and was really digging her feet in our carpet. And my mum was like, what's going on there? And she didn't have any carpet at home. She didn't have gas. She didn't have electricity. And wow. I don't know, somehow I'd sniffed her out and thought, I'd like to invite her round for tea, and always sort of picking up waifs and strays. And then I got bullied at school, and I think that really created a sense of injustice that felt really unfair, and that kind of first spawned my interest in wanting to become a psychologist, because initially I wanted to become a child psychologist and help. The thought of a child being distressed or upset was my main motivation for doing psychology at uni. But then I kind of got diverted because I did a placement with youth justice, and then that consolidated my interest in forensic psychology.
Right. And what particular areas? I know I was sort of reading your LinkedIn page earlier, and it was a lot of your studies was in looking at drugs, right? Yeah,
because I sort of accidentally fell into a specialism around substance misuse. That's as a result of my PhD, which looked at heroin and crack use in Essex, and I knew that drugs were such a prevalent issue in so many issues around crime, but I hadn't looked at it as a topic in its own right. And then for 3 years kind of immersed myself in the world of heroin and crack cocaine, and became a bit of not an expert, but specialised in that. And then subsequently have done lots of different evaluations and research projects looking at how we can make the best kind of substance misuse services for perpetrators of crime.
It's funny, so the way we're going to sort of splice this podcast up is with another talk with Bex. Bex's life experience involved spending a lot of her youth in prison, and she's going to give us a great perspective on what it's like, life sort of before, during and after that process, which is fascinating. But I just wonder, there's a lot of scrutiny on the prison system in this country, and it has been this way for several years. I think it's one of those issues that gets passed around by political parties, and no one seems to be adequately investing in it or taking note of it. Maybe it's actually because of the issues we've already discussed. It's just
unpopular.
It's not popular. It's not it's not a vote winner. No one's really out there marching for the welfare of prisoners. But one of the issues that was brought up on this recent general election we had in the UK was a certain degree of prison reform. And I remember, the only thing I can really remember from that was scrapping like short-term sentences. Like, do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I think that as Bex was saying to us before, that a short-term sentence can be terrible or brilliant depending on what situation you're coming from. So, Bex was describing earlier how a short sentence can actually offer a bit of respite. If you're homeless on the street and you just need a couple of weeks to get yourself sorted, then that may be more beneficial than somebody who's committed a petty offence. They're going to get a criminal record for not, and a conviction for not really anything worthwhile, and that sentence is not going to be helpful. I think the main thing about a short sentence is that there's not much work that can be done. No, let me rephrase that. There isn't much work that is done on a short sentence.
Yeah.
If a short sentence was used more productively while someone was in the prison system, then they wouldn't be as bad. That's the main issue. It's about how a sentence is used rather than how long it is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it was fascinating listening to Beck's talk and how she's sort of advocated for longer prison terms, because it's actually in that time that they get to engage with services. Are there any services you've observed in your studies that are more effective than others?
I think that there are ingredients that make a service or a system successful, and I think that I don't think that anybody should have to go to prison to get the help that they need. That support should be available in the community. Yeah,
if something's gone wrong, if people are committing crime for the sake of being housed in a prison where they might receive some sort of service, right? Because
there's all sorts of other... I know I'm going to answer your question. I know I've drifted, but I just want to say there are downsides to being in a prison. There's a risk of being institutionalised.
Yeah.
There's guys that have been in prison for so long they don't know how to cross a road anymore.
Yeah.
Like, they just haven't had to do that for however many years. But in terms of a service that makes a difference, I think any service that gives somebody time, that's not time limited, that views that person as a human being, treats that person as a human being, does what they say they're going to do, because people in our prison system have been let down so many times by so many people, so many systems, so many services, that if somebody is to sit down with someone and say, do you know what, you're all right, you've got loads of potential and I'm going to stick with you, that continuity of care, that consistency, like forming a human bond or relationship with someone, for an individual that might not have even made eye contact with someone for a number of years because they're so ashamed of their behaviour or society tells them that they're not worthwhile, they're the ingredients that make a service able to change somebody's life. Yeah.
Are there examples around the world that you know of where countries are dealing with prisoners better than we are?
Yeah, Norway. Norway's got it pretty good. I would love to go to Norway and find out more about their system, because their reoffending rates are really low. They actually incarcerate a very small number of people. I mean, in the UK, we imprison the largest number of individuals in Western Europe.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So we've got a lot of people in prison and a lot of people who reoffend when they come out of prison. So clearly there's an issue there. Whereas in Norway, they don't really imprison that many people. They prioritise who needs to go in there, and then when they come out, their reoffending rate is pretty low. So they do a good job in there, and I think one of the reasons is that their prisons tend to be purpose built. We're using prisons in this country which are, hundreds and hundreds of years old, and people sharing cells with, there's 3 men in a cell. Just like sort of decency and human rights issues are sort of being a little bit stretched there. And you know, if you're in an environment which feels unpleasant and it's dirty and it's rat infested, like how are we gonna like inspire people to change? And what are we saying about how worthwhile they are?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think, you know, if someone did a terrible thing to you, your property, your family, your loved ones, something, there is a huge part of you that wants retribution. That wants that individual to be punished, not just to be reformed, but to receive some sort of punishment for what they've done. And I completely get that, you know. And anyone who's listening that has been a victim of crime will be able to appreciate that. But the reality is, as well, is we want a better world, you know, without sounding like a complete idealist. Of course we do. We want less crime to take place. We want less people to be ill-affected by someone that might have hurt us, right?
Yeah.
So, and there are prisons around the world which are so horrendous that it's like, you know, it's a living hell. I don't think ours fit in that category, but they're terrible all the same, and I need no convincing of that. I mean, it's quite apparent. I just wonder there's people sometimes talk about prisons being like a holiday camp, you know, which of course they're not. But where do we position it? Where do we get it right? Yeah. So that a victim of crime
feels justice
is being done when that person is incarcerated. Yeah. But we still potentially foster rehabilitation.
Yeah. So I think that's such a valid point, and you know, I've worked with hundreds of victims of crime in my research as well as perpetrators of crime, so I definitely see both sides of the coin. And if a restrictive, punitive, nasty regime was going to mean that there were less victims in the world, I'd advocate for it, but I know that it doesn't. So the reason why I'm advocating for decent, humane systems that foster the opportunities for change is really with victims in mind, because we don't want future victims. You know, our justice system, in loss of liberty is their punishment. They're told when they can shower, when they can eat, when they can contact their loved ones. You know, yeah, they might have a TV in their room, but they're behind their door from about 5:30 in the evening. So imagine if we were in a cell with no source of entertainment, nothing to distract us, just our thoughts. How productive is that going to be for someone to not offend when they come out? Right. So I think it's always important to keep in mind that anything that's seen to be kind of soft or cuddly or, you know, like a holiday camp is actually only really done so with the vision to reduce reoffending and therefore future victims. Yeah. If that makes sense.
No, it does make sense. I think that a lot of public interest at the moment on prison systems in this country, not in many ways linked to what happened recently in the UK. There was a terrorist attack on London Bridge. A man by the name of Usman Khan, who had been imprisoned for a terrorism offence, and it was released on licence, committed a horrendous act and claimed lives as a consequence. That's going to get a lot of people angry. Right, and it's like there's money being spent on the program, prevent program, that it's looking. We've got to, how do we deal with these issues? How do we deal with radicalisation? Can we lock people up for eternity, or can we release them back into community in a safe fashion? And that was obviously a failing on our part in some way, on the government's part. What's your opinion on the way we deal with? I mean, I know sort of terrorism and dealing with radicalists isn't your area of specialism, but because of the timing, I'd be fascinated to hear your thoughts on this recent incident.
Yeah, so I'm doing a prevent project at the moment. I'm evaluating 3 prevent projects in the north of England currently. What I will say about that attack that happened recently in London is how pleased I was that the victim's father was really pushing the fact that this is not an opportunity. This shouldn't be used as an opportunity for a more punitive approach, but actually, and without knowing the full details of that case, what seems to have happened there is that individual was released from prison without the parole board kind of checking that person's risk. It happened automatically. He obviously didn't get adequate support in the community from any number of partners that will be involved. Like, we're just talking about the prison service here, but actually the justice system is made up of court, police, probation, CRC, when that's now being disbanded. But
what's CRC?
The National Probation Service was split up several years ago, and community rehabilitation companies are private companies which were designated to support lower risk offenders in the community, whilst the National Probation Service held on to the high risk offenders, and after several years it turns out that wasn't a good idea.
Right. Surprise.
Yeah, so my point is that we can use this as a platform to generate hate, generate fear, like aggression towards specific groups, incite all this kind of really heightened
anger.
When actually I think it's even more evidence that that person needed support. That he had access to an IP, which is an intervention provider. Generally, an intervention provider for somebody that's radicalised will go in for about 6 to 8 weeks and work with that person. That's not very long, really. They need to have consistent monitoring, but also consistent support. What's going on in that person's life? Why is he isolated? Who's he talking to? But we don't have the resources to input into those kind of cases, if that makes sense.
Yeah, completely. I mean, there's one of the sort of suggestions is that we build more prisons. I know certain political parties were advocating for that. Let's just build more prisons. That's what we're doing. We're overcrowded. Therefore, the answer is we just need to make more of these places. And US is another example for a point of comparison. Norway might be a positive one. And I don't want to be too sort of generalised in this approach, but I think it's fairly well sort of understood that the US prison system is in a bit of a mess as well. I know it's a privatised system; it's very different to us, but it's they lock up more people than any other country in the world, and have done so for a significant period of time now, which suggests that it's not working. Right? Surely a sign of a working criminal justice system is that crime will go down and reoffending will go down, and that I don't think that's evident. Forgive me if I'm talking nonsense, but I'm fairly confident that being the case. If building more prisons isn't the answer, what is?
Well, building more prisons would only solve the issue of overcrowding, which inevitably does cause issues.
Yeah.
We've mentioned about the number of guys in a cell, and I think our prison system at the moment is about 7,000 or 8,000 over what it was recommended to kind of contain. If that's not the answer, I think we need to go back to these, the root causes of crime. Why are people committing offences in the first place? Is it out of necessity because they don't have access to, is it an issue of survival? Is it because they need more mental health support to kind of deal with past trauma or anger issues or personality disorders, or, because so many parts of our system are cracking that I think that crime is a symptom of that.
Yeah.
So we really need to go back and look at those root causes and drivers. Bex and we were just talking earlier about substance misuse. So, we need to maybe invest more in kind of building recovery and reducing demand for substances. What are people using substances to cope with? What is it that's they're trying to escape from? If we could support people around managing that better. Do you know what I mean? So, and all of that requires time and money, and that's what's kind of been stripped from our system. I should also say at this juncture that whilst it feels like I'm being quite negative about the system, there are so many unbelievable professionals with such goodwill that want the same things that we're talking about, that joined the professions that they're in to give people opportunities for change.
Yeah.
But because the system is so stretched
Yeah.
and fit to burst, they're unable to kind of enact what they'd like to.
Yeah. You touched on the fact that we need to figure out why people are committing these crimes in the first place. What have you found any particular trends amongst your studies with prisoners? I imagine it's a sort of mixture of causes, but there's a typical trajectory, sort of dropping out early from school again because people maybe haven't had the time
it's given to them by teachers or parents to kind of say, hey, what's going on here? So people don't want to put their hand up, they don't want to ask for help, they fall by the wayside, then they're sort of out on the streets, they get involved in, other things, they need some ways to fund their lifestyle. I would say that like a lack of opportunities or a lack of early kind of support or investment. So like early intervention and prevention is so important. Like young people,
Yes.
like children,
Yes.
and also so much stuff in this arena is sort of intergenerational. So it's not hard to necessarily see like, what families
Yes.
this might be replicated in, or it's so hard to offer a succinct answer to that question, what kind of causes crime or what other kind of themes. I'd say what's more thematic is that across crime types, it doesn't matter if I'm interviewing someone who's in for murder or sexual offences or, drug offences. Actually, what people all say is that there wasn't really a space for me to go to and ask for early help, to say, okay, let's take a sexual offender for example. I'm having these thoughts. I know that they're inappropriate. I'd really like some early help with that. It's such a stigmatised offence that's not really a popular thing for you to take to your GP.
Sure.
Or, if you were experiencing anger issues, real jealous rage, who would you go and talk to about that? Like in terms of getting mental health support. There's lots of people that are crying out for help early doors, and they don't get that. And then they commit an offence. They get stuck in the criminal justice system. That's an opportunity for change.
Yes.
And sometimes that's available, and sometimes, sadly, it's not.
Yeah, that brings us back to that point, isn't it? There's something wrong with the system when we're only really going to deal with the matter within a prison or some sort of system like that. These measures need to be addressed way beyond someone commits a crime, and it's the system, right? It's like you've noticed, you've pointed out, we don't want to be so down because constantly being negative doesn't really help anything. But I'm noticing that there is a system in place where, if we're going to look at preventing such issues, a lot of it might be, or is, mental health issues that are related to people, whether they're depressed or they have mental health issues, can lead to crime. Okay, so let's lean into the NHS, right? The National Health Service in the UK. Let's lean into opportunities for people to talk to their doctors. Well, we know the NHS is massively stretched to getting a doctor's appointment is super hard. Getting a mental health assessment is super hard. There's the cycle, right? It's not binary. It's not simple. It's not black and white. These things are connected. I'm kind of interested, and I wish I'd asked you at the start, Sarah, like, as a doctor studying these things, you must spend a lot of time in prisons. Talk me through a working week for you.
Wow. Well, what I love about my job is that every day and every week is so variable. So I have my own research company, and as part of that, could be working on up to 10 different research projects at any one time, and they could be around modern slavery or steroid use or the prevent agenda or, causes of perpetrators of sexual offences, what are their drivers, so super varied. So a week might include, doing some work in different prisons across the country for different projects. It might be about interviewing people about how are the health services in prisons, how would they like to make them look different, or where are the gaps, what do they need? And then it might be travelling up north to interview a young person who's at risk of being radicalised and finding out, what do you need? How has this service helped you? Any day and in a day, I could be talking to different people about different things, but ultimately always about, is this service or system working for you? And if not, what do we need to put in place to make sure it does?
So valuable. And is that quantitative research? Is it qualitative research?
It is never quantitative. I hate statistics and numbers. I'll get somebody else to do that for me. So it's always qualitative, which is really beautiful because it means that I get to meet people, I get to hear their story for that hour or however long that I'm with them. I try and make sure that they're heard and they're listened to, and then I take my job really seriously in the fact that they've given me their time, their information, sometimes in a situation where they're like, what are you going to do for me? Like, nothing's changed before.
Right.
Why should I tell you this information? So I take it really seriously that I should do justice to what they've told me and share that information with change makers, with commissioners, with people who can make a difference. So qualitative is my thing.
What do you find rewarding about what you do?
I feel super privileged to walk in environments that people love a crime documentary on TV.
Yeah.
You know, all these fly on the wall prison documentaries that people love to watch and fascinated in. And I feel genuinely privileged that I get to travel across the country and step into somebody else's shoes just for a moment in time and try and experience and see things through their eyes. And like, honestly, I feel so lucky to be able to do that. Like, to just have a little look in and peek around and be like, oh, what's going on here then? Yeah. What's that about? You know, it's fascinating.
Why are these issues important to you? Why this and not another vast, psychology is a vast area you could be doing all sorts. Why have you been drawn into this?
Because I just feel like this is a marginalised group. It's a part of...
It's the waifs and strays again.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
You know, people always say, oh, aren't you scared going into prisons? And I say, no, because so many people in there are vulnerable.
Yeah.
And they may have committed a heinous crime, and I'm not saying that that's acceptable. Please don't think that in any way. But I'm saying, well, let's just look under the surface, and I care about this cause because I want to give people a voice that don't necessarily have a voice. Otherwise, they're a statistic, they're a number, they're a card, you know. They don't get their voice heard. So if I can give them that opportunity and try and instigate or initiate change. Like, I used to work one-to-one with people. I used to do one-to-one therapy in prisons, and I'd be frustrated because the things that were contributing to their agony were systemic. So that's why I moved into research to try and influence or use their voices to try and influence the system and make bigger change.
Yeah. Have you found much success?
Yeah, there's been pockets of success for sure. There have. There's a project in Essex that I did with a colleague several years ago, actually starting with my PhD, and as a result of that, there's now a service in Essex that exists to help offenders with complex needs, so that they don't fall through the gaps. You know, we tend to think of people as having like, oh, you use substances, or you've got mental health, or you're homeless. Well, what if I've got all three and I've got a learning difficulty?
Yeah.
You know, and it's like those people need multiple kind of resources and a holistic kind of approach. So there's a service now in Essex that exists to support that group as a result of our research, which I'm really proud of.
Sarah, I want to ask you what it's like if I, God forbid, was arrested for a crime and I got sentenced to prison. And what does that, for those of us that haven't been through that experience, what does that look like for someone going into the prison system?
Well, that's an interesting question. We probably should have asked Bex that, because I can only answer that as I'm still an outsider, right? Do you mean in terms of like what you could expect?
Yeah, I mean, Bex referenced certain services that were made available to her, and I just thought, I wonder if those are mandatory or whether they are, you can opt in. And what are you given the opportunity? Are you forced into certain opportunities or asked to take part in certain schemes, or is it, listen, you got to get through this time, you can choose to engage with this, but you can choose not to engage with this? What does it look like for someone coming into that system?
Okay, so when you come in at reception, you'll have an assessment, and they'll generally ask you what your kind of needs are around substance misuse, mental health, physical health. Whether you choose to engage with those health services is up to you. What's more mandatory is that you use your time meaningfully and therefore engage in either education or employment. Now, that's an important thing to raise because feedback that we've had recently in some of our projects has been that a lot of the time prisoners are engaging in activities where they're just getting up and going to a job, and they might be, sewing something. And actually they're thinking, all right, I'm out of my cell and it's killing a bit of time, but how is this going to help me reform, rehabilitate, progress on the outside? So, there's a plea that education and employment in prisons should be like meaningful and vocational and have a trajectory that carries them on the outside. that's the only real thing that's mandatory, to be honest, education or employment. They have association periods where they can come out of their cell, you know, if they're entitled to that, because they have like a privilege scheme where you go from either basic up all the way up to enhanced, so you have various different privileges. But there's a lot of time behind your door regardless of whether you're engaging in activities or not.
Yeah.
The service that I used to work for some time ago was primary care therapy. So if somebody in prison was experiencing depression or anxiety, they'd be eligible to have at least 6 sessions of therapeutic input. And those kind of services are a bit more limited now in prison. If you have to be experiencing quite severe mental health symptoms to warrant sort of mental health input.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that a bit sort of budgetary stretch situation?
Yeah, it's just prioritising things at that end of the spectrum rather than preventative and early intervention.
I'm thinking, we mentioned it earlier, I think we're just in conversation between us, there's a company in the UK called Timpsons. Anyone will know Timpsons if they need to get their keys cut or get a pair of boots rehealed, and they do a number of sort of jobs like that. They're a really positive employer for ex-offenders. In fact, they make it part of their strategy to offer opportunities to ex-offenders. And I wonder, Sarah, if you think that there are enough businesses actually offering opportunities, actively going into prisons and or engaging with the prison service and saying, well, listen, we'll give someone a chance. Beck spoke about it, didn't she? She said, the turning point for her was to have someone care and actually going into a workplace and having routine and structure, actually something she ended up embracing as part of her reformation. So I think that giving, so I was in Belmarsh prison earlier, and I think I mentioned to you, I said to some of the guys I was working with, I'm going to come and record this podcast later. Is there anything that you want me to say or get across for you? Yeah.
And one of the guys said, I don't know what I can do when I get out. I don't know what my options are. I don't know what I'm allowed to do. I don't know what I can apply for. There's such a sense of fear that if someone took the courage to apply for a job and had on their CV like that they have convictions, that they just wouldn't even be in the running. So people tend to shy away from that. If there was more of a culture of acceptance, I suppose, from employers, some prisons will have job fairs, and that's amazing, where local employers from the community will come in and actively recruit people so they know that when they come out, they've got an opportunity. I met one guy the other week in a different prison who said, I've been given a card and I know that when I get out, there's a job waiting for me.
Wow.
That's such a change maker.
Yeah.
I actually wrote a quote down from the CEO of Timpsons because I thought this was really profound. He said that in many ways, people in prison have failed society, but let's not forget that society has also failed them.
Yeah.
And that's why he really advocates for. It's not that people should be automatically given a job, but let's at least consider them in the same way that we'd consider any other applicant. Let's just see them as a person and their skills and how they come across in an interview, and let's give them an opportunity.
I'm always keen, at least, not to be an idealist. To be fair, to be reasoned, and to try and consider things from both perspectives. But I think there's definitely something, just on a personal level. Actually, I feel challenged a little bit about my opinion of ex-offenders, especially coming from being an ex-police officer. What was amazing is sitting down with Bex. I loved that, and it's a classic, isn't it? It's like, if you're scared of your neighbour, go and say hello.
Yeah.
And I think spending time, either you don't have to necessarily offer a job opportunity, but actually speaking to someone that has been through that process of being involved in the prison system in some way. I think it's important, isn't it? Because it just immediately, in many cases, breaks any fear you may have built up, or some sort of what word am I trying to think of? Sort of stereotype of an expectation that you're going to get from a hardened ex-villain, right? I'm not going to mix with that sort of individual. Actually, go and talk to somebody. Be prepared to have a relationship in some way, or even just offer them some of your time in some way. I think you'll have your thoughts challenged. And
Bex is an amazing example of why this kind of work is so important, because she's demonstrated that change is possible. And if we had the attitude of, oh, what's the point, just lock everyone away and, you know, hope for the best, or, well, we'll deal with it when they're released, you know, like that's clearly ineffective. And Bex is an amazing example, someone that's turned her life around with support from certain pockets of the system, and is a shining example of why we shouldn't give up.
I loved the way she articulated the sense of just having someone believe in her.
Oh, yeah.
You know, just having someone want the best for her.
Yeah.
How important that was, how fundamental that was.
And I think that's the thing, right? There's, like I said before, there are people working in our justice system, loads of them, you know, who do believe in change. They work in that field because they want to help support change. The problem is that it's kind of fragmented. So I might have a prison officer in prison who really believes in me, but then when I'm released, I have a probation officer who doesn't have time to see me, or I still don't have housing. So we need like a conjoined system where that theme, that approach, that ethos, that approach where I'm seen as a valuable, worthwhile human being who's worth investing in and supporting, giving a chance, like permeates across the whole system, from the police to the court system. You know, I volunteer in custody where I live. I go and check that people are being treated fairly in custody. And I spoke with a sergeant there the other week, and he was saying, you know, I see this is the front door, this custody suite. It's the front door. It's maybe the first opportunity that someone has with help. And so if the police are using that as an opportunity, not just to arrest and convict, but they're saying, okay, while you're here, do you need any help? Like, how's your mental health? Do you need to see a nurse? You know, that's just, if that permeates across the system, I just think that's a way healthier approach. Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it? Bex, and you've both brought up this continuity of care, something consistent through that all that change and being cut here and transferred there and coming in and out of prison and dealing with different people, but actually having some sense of constance in their life. How important that was. Yeah. You might have already done it, but I was going to just ask you, if you were to tomorrow you're made emperor of this land, and you know, let's wave a wand, and you have the power to totally reform the way we do, the criminal justice system, or at least in respect to the prison system. If you were to distill it down into something super basic and easy to understand for a Luddite like me, you know, how would you surmise your findings, your opinion?
So I think that all prisons should be configured as an enabling environment. There's something that exists. It's an actual certification that prisons can get and environments can get, and they are an accredited enabling environment. And that means that place is a place which, seeping through the walls, is a commitment to enable change, to treat people decently, to have a mutual level of respect between officers and prisoners, and create a culture of hope, to foster an empowering environment. You know, and even as I'm saying these words, I'm thinking, well, what about this person that's committed this crime? Or, you know, my mum's been a victim of crime. Like, I still think that because it would enable a reduced reoffending rate. Of course, there would still be some people who would say, screw the system and I'm not ready for change. But I do genuinely believe that if we create wings, prisons, communities where people are, opportunity flourishes, and you can form those connections and human relationships where someone says, you know what, you've got loads of potential. That would be conducive to change. And
it's got to continue on the outside, hasn't it?
Yeah.
You know, with these positive environments on the inside, enabling environments on the inside, they go outside and it dies overnight. You get. So what's this £46 thing about that Bex mentioned?
That's their discharge grant. Yeah, that's it. That's what you will leave prison with. They'll give you £46. That might be to get, you can use that to get home or to get wherever you need to be. Because you might be being released and you've got to travel 100 miles to your bail hostel or wherever you need to get to. And that's just to tide you over, get you your first meal, that kind of thing. But
without housing in certain cases being secured, or certainly for Beck's case, in very, very few cases, many times she came out of prison was any housing arranged.
Well, a third of our prisoners will come out without having secure housing or anywhere to go.
Wow.
And that's the thing, right? If you committed a driving offence, okay, God forbid, a million times you accidentally killed someone, right?
Yeah.
Okay, you're now a perpetrator of an offence. You're going into prison.
Yes.
Everyone abandons you. You come out. You've got nowhere to live. How could I honestly say that I wouldn't drink or steal or, you know, like it's just basic survival. So we're almost setting people up to fail by giving them. By not, it's like basic human needs. It's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And often,
don't ask me to quote what that is, like food, warmth.
Yeah, exactly.
Water.
Shelter. You know, they people sometimes don't have those basic needs met. So the other thing is that quite often, and this is going back to your kind of like, oh, what would I do if I was emperor of the world? Not the world, just
which
the
you
UK.
often focus on.
Right? Yeah, just the UK prison system. You know, quite often people are just trying to meet the needs that everyone else is trying to meet. Human connection, relatedness, you know, purpose. So if we can support people to meet those basic human goods that we're all trying to achieve, except they don't necessarily have the skill sets or the opportunities to achieve them in a pro-social way, then we've actually all got a shared agenda. Let me help you, like, get a purpose or feel connected to other human beings in a way that you don't have to harm others to do so. Can I ask you a question?
Oh, gosh. Yes.
So given your background in the police...
I can edit this out, right?
Sure. Given your background, don't forget I'm an interviewer too. Given your background in policing and working in, you know, modern slavery and human trafficking and what you saw in your time away... has today in our conversation challenged any of your kind of views or perceptions around justice and rehabilitation?
I think it has. I mean, I think what's interesting, and like I said earlier, I am kind of keen to try and be as balanced and fair as possible. But I'll give you a story in answer to your question. Maybe this will buy me more time to think of something more succinct to say. But I arrested a man once. He was wanted for a very violent crime, for multiple crimes, and actually in the process of he was on the run, and there was a big chase, and he stabbed my colleague, and I ended up, or at least I was involved in arresting him, and he'd hurt my friend, and he'd hurt a lot of people, and I was angry and I was upset, but I transported him to custody, and when I presented him to the custody sergeant, actually all I saw was a very, very scared young man. And I was amazed, actually. And this is not. I'm certainly not making out that I'm some sort of naturally compassionate person or whatever. But I just felt a renewed sense of grace for as I saw this guy standing there, thinking, like, what he's done is horrendous. But where's this bloke come from? He's a youngster, you know. Where's he come from, and what does his future look like? And balancing those two parts of your character is a challenge. I think I feel challenged, and what this conversation and definitely from meeting with Bex, it's just don't allow yourself, right, to get to think you've got it all summed up, and that allow your views to be challenged, you know. And I want my views to be challenged. I don't want to feel comfortable in my you know, I've got it figured out. I know what needs to be done. The prisons are a mess. I want to hear, I want to learn, I want to be educated, I want to have my views challenged. And I'm actually more interested in being the gracious, compassionate version of myself than the hardened, scared, angry version of myself. So I think the thoughts that have sort of this issue evokes for me is don't write these people off, actually. And I wonder if I can look for more opportunities to possibly engage with ex-offenders.
Good.
Is that
I'm
okay?
pleased. Yeah.
I don't know if that will make the cut, but I'll have to listen back to it. So thanks so much for coming on the podcast. You know, it's such an interesting issue. There's so much more we could talk about, and we could try and deconstruct these more specific issues to talk about. So substance misuse and homelessness and suicide in prisons and all of these things that are linked. But but we don't have time to do all of those. So I appreciate that we've kind of stuck to a high-level agenda on this discussion, but it's been really, really helpful. And what a remarkable person you are, and your knowledge is phenomenal. I'm so grateful that you have got... you've been graced and with a personality that wants to spend time with people that most of us don't or don't feel driven to, and I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful that you're working in the criminal justice system to try and see it improved. So thank you. And I just wonder if you could ask the world, ask the listeners, ask me, if you could if you could challenge us in some way about this issue, what would you ask of us?
I would probably ask that before you judge anyone, perpetrator of crime or not, just to consider that person's story and just to think, I wonder what's going on for them. Whether it's someone being rude to you in a coffee shop or, I don't know, having a bit of an attitude, just stopping and thinking, I wonder what's going on for that person, and just having a bit of kindness in your heart before you judge or make an assumption about where that's coming from.
I always send the same questions out beforehand to every guest on the podcast, and sometimes we touch on them, sometimes we don't. But I would love you to finish with your answer if you've got the same one. So my question, which was, if you could ask the world to change in one way, what would you ask? Do you want to read it?
I want to see what I wrote. What did I write? Is it Miss World-esque?
Yeah, world peace.
Oh, yeah, there you go. That's not dissimilar to what I just said. Just to be kind, right? Just to be kind always. There's no need to be unkind. There really isn't.
Yeah.
Go and have a rant in your car and swear and say whatever you want, but you don't need to be mean to people. You don't know what the impact of that could be on them, and you don't know what day they're having or what life they've had. Just be nice.
That's what I liked about it, the simplicity.
Yeah, everyone just be nice.
Everyone just be nice.
Exactly. It's not hard, right?
Right. Thank you so much for
You're
coming
welcome.
on.
Thank you so much for having me.
I love that. After all of the academia and countless hours of research, everyone just be nice. Just think of all the problems in the world that would be resolved if everyone was just nice to each other. You know what? I think she might be onto something. What I found interesting about that talk with Sarah is hearing how she's come away from her many interactions with people in prison with a real supporter's mentality, championing the belief that reducing reoffending only comes from engaging positively, not just punitively. I think she's right. By simply locking people away in a big steel and concrete box and hoping that when they come out of that box, somehow all of their issues have been resolved, I think we might just be hoping for a bit too much. I think my major takeaway from the last two podcasts is just hearing how prison can be a really positive intervention and not just a form of punishment. Can I leave it there? Is it fair for me to be so simplistic and reductive? Probably not. But for now, I think I will put this one down. So you heard Sarah and I both mention the business Timpsons in the podcast for being a positive employer for ex-offenders. I want to tell you about two other businesses working positively with ex-offenders. They both happen to be coffee companies. One of them is called Redemption Roasters, which is based in East London. And the other is called New Ground Coffee. They're based in Oxfordshire, but they have got a pop-up in Selfridges at the moment. Both are brilliant initiatives providing opportunities in the coffee industry for ex-offenders, so check them out. On the subject of coffee, next episode is entirely dedicated to that particular product. We're going to be speaking to Josh Clark, the head of coffee at Clifton Coffee Roasters, and Sam McQuaig, their head coffee sourcer. And we're going to be discussing the challenges of working in the coffee industry ethically, transparent supply chains, doing business in the developing world, a number of other subjects, at least for me, I find fascinating, and they're a really great pair of guys to educate us on that subject. So please tune in for that in a couple of weeks' time. So it's thank you time again. Can I say a particular thank you to Kelly and her team at the Jury's Inn in Brighton. So kind of them to put us up in that conference room so we could record the second part of our podcast. They didn't charge us or anything. I'm really grateful for that. if you enter the discount code, the Justice and Coffee podcast, on Juries in Hotel website, you'll receive... No, I'm joking, of course. There's literally there's nothing in it for them at all. They were just very, very kind and sympathetic to our cause, wanted to support us, so they gave us that space. Thank you, Kelly, and your team. I'm really grateful. Thank you to Neil and thank you to Dan for donating to our Kickstarter campaign to fund this podcast. Thanks so much, gents. This show was produced by Blue Bear Coffee Company. You can find out about us if you go online at www.bluebearcoffee.com. Please search for us and follow us along on social media, Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. Until next time, peace.